Hi, I'm Mark Loux, Extension Weed Scientist at The Ohio State University, and I'm standing in one of our screens we did. This is summer of 2021. We put these out for various reasons, to train our weeds team, to do some other field days and train other people. So we have a block here that we put residual herbicides out and planted various crops and weeds, and we're going to walk through this and take a look at primarily spectrum of control. There's not a lot of symptomology out here, but I think it's a good reminder. We've got some corn herbicides and some soybean herbicides out here, and it's kind of a good reminder of, what you'll see here, along with my discussion on what the spectrum of control is, especially relative to, I think, water hemp and some of the pigweed issues that we're having. And keep in mind that herbicides work differently. Every time we do one of these screens, it comes out sort of differently. I think we have some pretty good activity here, but sometimes you see way more activity and sometimes not as much as you expect. So I think this is really fairly representative. So we'll walk down through and I'll point a few things out. So this first plot is pendimethalin prowl. Pendimethalin's, I think, primarily known for being a grass herbicide, but it also picks up pigweeds pretty well, lamb's quarter pretty well. And those are the two broadleafs that it's really probably best on. You do see in this plot we have a sprinkling of water hemp out here, and you can see actually in this plot you see some pigweed coming through and some water hemp coming through. Prowl is a herbicide that likes a lot of rain to work well, ideally probably incorporated, but most of it doesn't go that way. So not a lot of injury. It's safe on beans. We have several different hybrid corn, field corn, and then that front row of corn is popcorn, and then there's a row of sweet corn in the back. So Prowl is labeled pre-emergence on certain types of corn. And when you do that, the combination of its water insolubility and the corn coming up through that, and the fact that pendimethalin's a root uptake herbicide, you avoid injury. So you can't incorporate pendimethalin and plant corn into it. And so you do see a little bit of injury there on the more sensitive types of corn. Popcorn and sweet corn are typically going to show injury more. I did pull some roots. Pendimethalin's a root inhibitor, so this is a plant right next to the plot with a pretty well developed root system. And then here you have your reduced root system, even on a plant there that's roughly the same size as I just showed you. It's a pretty reduced root system. Sometimes you have clubbing of roots and an orangish color and those type of things. I don't think you necessarily see that here, but there's a lot of stubbiness, like right coming off there, you can see some stubby roots. So that's an indicator. If you look at spectrum, Prowl's a herbicide. If you don't incorporate it, you do introduce some variability in control, and you can see some grasses coming through, some pigweed. It has actually some activity on velvet leaf, but nothing in this plot did amazingly on velvet leaf for the most part. So that's pendimethalin. This is clomazone, or Command, which is a soybean herbicide. It's a pigment inhibitor. Command's a grass herbicide, also controls velvet leaf extremely well. That's what it's known for, and a few other broadleafs. For example, has some activity on common ragweed. It's got a little bit of activity on giant ragweed. The row of velvet leaf you can see is completely absent here. It's a very good herbicide on lamb's quarter. You can see pigweed coming through it pretty much at will. It's not a pigweed herbicide. Some of the weeds that it doesn't actually control well, but you have activity on, like giant ragweed's interesting. You can see the symptomology on the giant ragweed, from the pigment inhibitor, and you will see when we put Command out with other herbicides, it does contribute to control in some cases, and you can see you have some plants like this one where it's kind of whacked it and it's not really going to do very much, and then you have other ones that are just kind of yellow and sitting there that'll probably come back. Command's not labeled for corn. We've done some work early on with some safeners and things like that with clomazone on Command, and if you safen a little bit, it actually can be safe on corn. You can see in this case it really didn't do much to the corn. So but a really effective, consistently effective grass herbicide. Doesn't need a lot of rainfall typically for it to work well. Okay, these next four plots, I'm just going to kind of walk down through and not point out a lot of individuals. So we have this is the group 15 acetamide herbicides, the shoot inhibitors. Yeah, so you have dimethenamide, Outlook, which is Outlook, Warrant, which is acetochlor, metolachlor, which we have various products, and then down on the end, pyroxasulfone, which is Zidua, and some other products. So these are primarily grass herbicides that also have activity on pigweed, water hemp, depending on the herbicide. Like if it's Zidua or acetochlor, it'll have more activity on lamb's quarter typically, or it can. And then you have some variability in control with weather and things like these that separates this out. I would say if you look at our data, you know, we're always going to say that metolachlor and the pyroxasulfone are the two probably more consistent grass herbicides that last the longest. That doesn't mean they do in every situation. And we typically start to see more variability in control sometimes with the acetochlor and the dimethenamide. And in this case, you see, if you're walking down through, you see the dimethenamide and the acetochlor just kind of generally looking rougher. The acetochlor really didn't work on the grass that well here. Then you get into the metolachlor and then the pyroxasulfone, which are a little bit more consistent. So. This is Elite 27, which is isoxaflutol, which has been sold for years as Balance Pro in corn. So in corn, the Balance Pro has a safetener in it that helps with safety. And Elite 27 is the soybean herbicide for the GT27 bean. It's not labeled in every county in Ohio still. Isoxaflutol has always been a very broad spectrum herbicide. It's got considerable grass activity. It's got pretty considerable broadleaf activity. It looks really strong here. It can be a little bit weak on pigweeds. And it's not what we consider a metolachlor or peroxisone equivalent grass herbicide, but it helps suppress grasses. Way back when one of the ways that isoxaflutol was used in corn was mixing it with some atrazine and simazine. People tried to get away with that because of the extra grass activity you got from it. And again, it wasn't probably consistent as a mix of atrazine and acetochlor in some cases, but you can see it whacking the beans pretty good here, and you can see it's a pigment inhibitor. You can see the pigment inhibitor symptomology on the beans. That's the GT27 bean that has resistance to isoxaflutol. So has a nice fit in that bean, especially if you're looking at a lot of ALS resistance, which limits the activity of some of your other residual herbicides. And then this is mesotrione or Callisto, which I think is a little bit of an interesting plot for mesotrione. So mesotrione is not a grass herbicide. It's a residual herbicide, and it's used with a lot of different premixes, and then we're using it, people were tank mixing because of the low price of mesotrione generics now. So, but you can see if you look at, compare it to the Elite 27, we just looked at the isoxaflutol, you basically don't see any grass activity, which is typical for mesotrione, I think. And then you see reasonably good broadleaf activity, took out the pigweeds, took out the velvet leaf. There's a little bit of purslane coming through here, but nobody cares about that. It's actually got reasonable activity on both these herbicides, have reasonable activity on giant ragweed, at least some, to kind of get you started. And then what's interesting here is really not only the beans haven't really even been slowed down, but it kind of goes back to my comment about sometimes things just don't work the way you expect them to. There's a little bit of symptomology from the mesotrione, a little bit of bleaching on those bean leaves. Between the two, we have seen in some cases from late applications in dry weather some mesotrione carryover, and you can see that's not really a good indicator of that, but there's not really any symptomology here. So, and if you're looking at water hemp programs, both these herbicides would have a fit in helping to control water hemp for sure. So then we're into 4 soybean herbicides, and usually when you use these residual from a pre-emergence or pre-plant application, they're pre-mixed, and so we're looking at the individual components here, which I think is interesting. It gives you a pretty good handle. But like these first two are Climuron Classic and Chlorantholam First Rate, which really don't get used by themselves pre-emergence and soybean programs. So this does give you a handle on kind of what they do, but they're almost always going to be with something else. It's going to be with a flumioxazine valor or a sulfentrazone. So Classic and First Rate are basically both broadleaf herbicides. You can see in this case it looks like the Climuron's giving you a little bit better grass activity. They're basically okay on pigweed and water hemp. The problem is that most of our water hemp is ALS resistant, so they won't work on that. And you can see a little bit of pigweed coming through here. They're okay velvet leaf herbicides really, but the velvet leaf didn't respond well here. You can see the First Rate here over on this side being a little bit gentler on the corn. I did pull some plants up in the Climuron plot, which is between these two. You can see the corn stunted in the Climuron plot, and it's also inhibits corn roots, and it's more of what's known as a bottle brush in some cases. So that's a plant next to the plot. You can see the root system there, and then you can see even on this one how inhibited that root system is. And if you look at that up close, you can see what we call some bottle brushing, where you know that one there where it looks like you've got a series of very short roots coming off that main root there. So that's a pretty typical diagnostic characteristic. We also have some ALS resistant giant ragweed out here. So both of these have activity, decent activity on giant ragweed up front, 70%, 60 to 80%, depending on the moisture and things like that, but we have a fair amount of ALS resistance. So. And then these last two are the PPO inhibitors, group 14, the flumioxazin here, and then the sulfentrazone here, which are used really widely in soybeans right now to help with water hemp, among other things, and are, again, typically premixed with either a Pursuit or Clemuron or Clansalam. And these are relatively similar products. They both have some grass activity. You can see in this case the sulfentrazone on my left giving a little bit better grass activity. They actually did better on the velvet leaf than the ALS inhibitors did. And then if you can see some injury on soybeans sometimes, but basically the soybeans came through. The other difference is that flumioxazin is labeled on corn, right? So you can see the corn taking the flumioxazin well, sulfentrazone's not. So you can see the sulfentrazone stunning the corn here. I think this is over the top, sort of over the top grass activity, especially for the sulfentrazone, but it does contribute, and that's one of the things that makes those premixes work in soybeans, where you're just going to come back with a post and you're not putting another grass herbicide in. And then they're very effective upfront pigweed, lamb's quarter, typically velvet leaf, water hemp materials, unless you have PPO resistant water hemp, and in that case, you know, you may see a reduction in longevity of control. Okay, this last plot is metribuzin, which actually looks really good here. Metribuzin is primarily a broadleaf herbicide. There's quite a rate response from metribuzin, so in our studies we always see a nice response between 4 ounces all the way up to 12. We consider 6 to 8, depending on soil type, to sort of be a minimum rate. We have some triazine resistant lamb's quarter out here, but typically good on lamb's quarter, pigweed, water hemp up front. It's got, like the flumioxazin and sulfentrazone, does have some grass activity up front depending on rate. It's got activity on mare's tail. Generally at the rates we're using it and the way we're using it, it's safe on beans. If you go back in history long enough, higher rates applied pre-emergence in conventional till, you'd be more likely to see some triazine symptoms. And metribuzin is actually labeled at lower rates in corn, so it is safe to corn, and you see that here. So just kind of a reminder on Spectrum, anytime you're planning herbicide programs, that the tables in the weed control guide, the effectiveness tables, are a good resource for you there. We typically try to include a lot of premixes as well as the single ingredients, and then when you look at the table, like for water hemp, for example, we'll have the different types of resistance, and also for common ragweed and some things like that. So if you know what resistance you have, kind of helps you sort through those options.